The American Old West did not end all at once. It faded piece by piece. The great outlaw hideouts began to quiet down. The railroads stretched farther. Telegraphs, newspapers, and law enforcement started connecting places that had once felt distant and unreachable. But every now and then, someone came along who made the country feel wild again. Harry Tracy was one of those men. He was not the most successful outlaw. He was not the richest. He was not the leader of some famous gang. But for a short time in 1902, Harry Tracy showed that one desperate man could still terrify towns, embarrass lawmen, dominate newspapers, and make people wonder whether the frontier was really gone at all. This is why his story matters, because Harry Tracy stands right at the edge of two worlds. The old outlaw frontier that was disappearing behind him, and the modern America that was closing in all around him. And somewhere between those two worlds, Harry Tracy became one of the most feared, most hunted, and most forgotten outlaws in American history. Howdy and welcome back to Wild West Deep Dives. Today, we are starting a brand new deep dive series into the life of Harry Tracy. And I'll say this right up front, I think Harry Tracy may be one of the most underrated outlaws of the American West. Now, he may not have the same name recognition today as some of the other famous outlaw names, but in the summer of 1902, Harry Tracy was one of the most talked about men in America. Newspapers followed him day by day. Posses chased him across Oregon and Washington. Rumors spread from town to town, and for a short time, it seemed like the entire Pacific Northwest was watching to see where Harry Tracy would appear next. But the Harry Tracy story is not just a manhunt. It is a story of a restless, violent, complicated man whose life moved through the fading years of the Old West. We're going to follow him from his early years, through his first steps into crime, his time in prison, his partnership with David Lant and David Merrill, the escape from the Oregon State Penitentiary, and then the long chase that turned him into national news. And like always, we're going to try to separate the facts from the legend, because with Harry Tracy, that is not so easy. Some of the stories told about him were exaggerated, some were probably wrong, but some of the true parts are just as wild as anything that ever could be added later. Before we get into it, I just want to give a huge thank you to Paul Knowles and everyone at the Museum of Northwest Colorado in Craig. They were a massive help with this series, and the Museum of Northwest Colorado is doing incredible work preserving the history of the Old West. This is one of those stories that surprised me the deeper I got into. The more I researched Harry Tracy, the more I wondered how his name is not better known today, especially out west. Because in the summer of 1902, Tracy was not just another outlaw name in the newspaper. He was the escaped convict people feared might walk out of the timber, appear at their door, and force them into the chase whether they wanted to be part of it or not. And to understand how Harry Tracy became that man, we have to go back to the beginning. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. One of the hardest things about telling the story of Harry Tracy is that right away, even the basic facts can get messy. Almost everywhere you look, you'll see some version of the same thing. Little is known about Harry Tracy's childhood, and that is partly true. We do not have every detail, we do not have a perfect record, we don't even have a birth certificate. But the biggest problem is not just that information is missing. The bigger problem is that so much bad information got repeated. After Harry Tracy became famous in 1902, people rushed to tell his story. Newspapers wrote about him, dime novelists turned him into a character, later writers repeated those stories, and before long, the real Harry Tracy was buried under a pile of rumors, mistakes, and outright fiction. Depending on which account you read, Harry Tracy was born in Wisconsin, Kentucky, New York, Missouri, or some other place entirely. Some accounts give the wrong year, some give the wrong name, some claim he was born into a completely different background, and some early writers basically created a dramatic outlaw origin story for him because they either did not know the truth or did not care enough to find it. The best evidence comes from the book Harry Tracy, The Last Desperado by Jim Dolanty, which is not just another book on Tracy, it is the book on Harry Tracy. Dolanty spent more than 50 years researching on Western history, including a ton of time on Harry Tracy, tracking down records, family accounts, prison files, newspaper stories, local memories, and all the myths that had built up around him. God bless him. He recently passed away, but the work he left behind is unbelievable. not just on Tracy, but on countless characters and events of our great American West. So throughout this series, when the stories conflict, his research is going to be the backbone I lean on. According to Dolanty, Harry was born Harry Severns, likely around 1874 in Wood County, Wisconsin, most likely Pittsville, though nearby Seneca, a short distance north, is also possible because that is where his parents, Orlando and Sarah Severns, were living. Pittsville had been settled for nearly 25 years by the time Harry was born, but it was still something of a pioneer settlement, and in a place like that, birth certificates were not always treated as essential records, so no certificate has ever been found. And because that record was missing, the door was left wide open for confusion. One of the biggest sources of that confusion came from the dime novels. In 1908, a dime novel called Tracy, the Outlaw, King of the Bandits, claimed Harry was born around 1871 and that his birthplace was probably either Louisville, Kentucky or Dutchess County, New York. Another dime novel placed him along the Hudson River near Newburgh, New York. Now, Harry Tracy did have a New York connection, but not in the way those stories made it sound. His family had roots there. His great-grandfather, Nye Severns, had lived in Ovid, New York, and Harry's grandfather, James Quick Severns, was born there. But that does not mean Harry Tracy was a New Yorker. That is how these stories get started. A small piece of truth gets pulled out of context, repeated a few times, and eventually turns into a false biography. Even serious writers got caught up in it. James D. Horan, a well-known Western historian, leaned toward the idea that Tracy was born in Missouri and wrote that his correct name was not really known. Others repeated claims that he was born in Kentucky, New York, or somewhere else. Then there is the Minun confusion. In the early 1860s, Gary Williams of the Spokane Spokesman Review contacted the Oregon Penitentiary and found records saying Tracy was born in Minun, Wisconsin. That sounds important, except for the fact that Minun was founded in 1888, 14 years after Harry was born. But the mistake makes sense once you understand the family timeline. Harry's family did live near Minun later, and in many ways that area became as close to a hometown as anywhere he lived for a meaningful stretch of time. So Minun matters to the story, it just probably was not his birthplace. Then there is the claim out of Lodi, Wisconsin. In August of 1902, the Portage Daily Register repeated a story from the Lodi Express, claiming Harry Tracy may have been born there. According to that account, a family named Severn once lived in Lodi, and neighbors remembered a boy they called Harry Tracy Severn as a violent-tempered child. After the family moved north, some of those old residents became convinced that that boy they remembered and the outlaw Harry Tracy were the same person. But that story has problems too. First, Tracy was not his childhood name. Second, the spelling of Severns is off. And third, the description of him as a holy terror does not line up very well with the several memories of Harry as a mostly good-hearted, restless, mischievous boy. So we have to treat the Lodi story as a big maybe. Maybe the family passed through there. Maybe some local memory got tangled up after Tracy became famous. Or maybe there was another boy people were remembering. But based on the best research, Pittsville or nearby Seneca remains the strongest answer. And that brings us to the biggest point. Harry Tracy's early life is not impossible to talk about. The legend wants him to appear out of nowhere, a born outlaw, already dangerous, already violent, already headed for a life of crime. But the real story is much more complicated than that. Before he was Harry Tracy, he was Harry Severns. And before he became one of the most feared fugitives in the West, he was a boy from Wisconsin whose early life was misunderstood, misreported, and in some cases, completely invented by the people who came along later. To understand the world Harry Severns was born into, we do have to step back for a moment and look at his family. He did not come from some line of outlaws or criminals. In fact, one of the more interesting parts of his early life is that his family background was fairly respectable. Harry's grandfather was James Quick Severns. James was born in New York in 1825, and like a lot of families in that period, the Severns family kept moving west. They went from New York to Ohio, then Illinois, and eventually into Wisconsin. James was one of those hardworking frontier types who did a little bit of everything. He worked as a cabinet maker, a millwright, a surveyor, a land agent, and later got involved in the lumber business. By the late 1840s, he had moved into central Wisconsin, and at what is now Pittsville, he established a lumber mill. This is where the family roots in Wisconsin really began. James was also a Civil War veteran. He joined Company G of the 37th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment in 1864 and was sent to the front near Petersburg, Virginia. During the fighting, a mine exploded and James was wounded in several places. One wound was serious enough to put him in a field hospital for about 2 months, but he returned to duty and eventually came home after the war. The war left him physically damaged and hard labor became more difficult for him. But James Severns was not some broken down nobody. Back in Pittsville, he became a respected man in the community. He served in local offices, worked as town clerk, sat on the town board, and for 13 years served as Justice of the Peace. And that detail is hard to ignore. Harry Tracy's grandfather, the grandfather of one of the most wanted men in America in 1902, was a Justice of the Peace. That does not mean Harry was destined for a good life. It does not mean family reputation could save him. But it does show that Harry did not come from a family where crime was normal. On his grandfather's side, at least, he came from a family tied to work, community, local respect, and public service. Harry's father was Orlando Severns, born in Wisconsin in 1849. Orlando grew up in that same timber country. He worked in the woods like many young men in central Wisconsin. He was remembered as rugged, handsome, and a good hunter. In January of 1873, Orlando married Sarah C. Atkinson. Sarah was from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and she would become one of the most important people in Harry's life. For the next several years, Orlando and Sarah lived around the Seneca and Pittsville area. This is where Harry was likely born, around 1874. Again, we cannot say with absolute certainty whether it was Pittsville or nearby Seneca, but Wood County, Wisconsin is the strongest answer. For the first few years of his life, Harry was an only child. His brother Irvie wouldn't come along until around 1880, and his sister was born a year or so later. Harry's early years placed him close to his grandparents, especially his grandfather James. At different times, Harry stayed with them in Pittsville. Part of that may have been practical, but it also seems that James simply loved the boy and wanted him around. Harry liked being there too. He had old playmates in Pittsville, and because his grandfather was respected, Harry was not just some anonymous kid, he belonged to a known family. But the Severns family did not stay in one place. The family's world was tied to timber, and by the 1880s, the logging industry was pushing farther and farther north. The forests around central Wisconsin had been cut hard, and the timber moved north. Families connected to that work often moved with it. They moved in stages through northern Wisconsin and eventually ended up around Monoin, Chitimo, and Desrosiers Lake. This was rougher, more isolated country. Roads were poor, settlements were small. Logging camps and railroad work shaped the area. Families leaned on one another, and people saw a lot of the same neighbors because there were simply not that many people around. By about 1889, the Severns family had settled near Desrosiers Lake, about a mile north of Chitimo. Chitimo itself was named after Chief Chitimo, also known as Agritimo, a Chippewa man who lived in the area. At first, native people outnumbered the white settlers there, and the two groups generally got along. The old chief told white children stories of battles with the Sioux and Blackfeet, and the white children came in and out of his home almost like it was their own. So this was the world Harry grew up in, not the romantic outlaw west of the dime novels, but the woods and small settlements of Wisconsin. Logging camps, railroads, hunting, small communities, and people trying to make a life in a country that still felt pretty raw. That matters, because later in life, when Harry Tracy is living rough, hiding in timber, moving through country, and staying ahead of posses, some of those skills did not just appear out of nowhere. He grew up in the woods. He knew what it meant to live isolated. He knew how working men talked, how camps operated, and how to move through rough places. But as a boy, Harry was not remembered as some obvious future killer. That is another important thing. The memories of him are mixed, but many of them are surprisingly positive. Some remembered him as spirited, mischievous, and full of energy. One schoolmate later described him pretty harshly, saying he was near the bottom of the class and skipped school whenever he could. But other people remembered him differently. A Pittsville newspaper later said many residents remembered him as bright and intelligent. Even the warden of the Oregon prison, years later, said Tracy had a quick mind, direct speech, nerves of steel, and a good command of language despite not having much formal education. So was Harry a bad student? Probably. Was he also sharp? Definitely. He may not have cared much for school, especially with his families moving around and work becoming more important as he got older. But that does not mean he was not smart. If anything, later events show he was a quick, observant, and able to think under pressure. The people around Chitimo and Minot also remembered a softer side of him. Around 1890 or 1891, Harry's little sister died while the family was living near DeRozier's Lake. Her name is not remembered, but Harry's reaction was. Emma Goodwin Smith, whose family was close to the Severns family, later remembered that Harry was deeply upset, not only because his sister had died, but because of what it did to his mother. He helped his mother, he talked to her, he stood behind her chair and rocked her while she cried. When Harry started crying too, his mother told him not to cry for his sister because crying would not bring her back. And Harry told her he was not crying for his sister, he was crying for her. This is the kind of moment that complicates the story, because later, Harry Tracy would be remembered as dangerous, violent, arrogant, and ruthless, and in many ways, he was. But as a boy, some people remembered him as thoughtful and good-hearted, especially toward his mother. Other neighbors remembered similar things. Minnie DeRozier said her grandmother always liked Harry best of the two Severns boys. The DeRoziers had cows, and because there were no fences, those cows often wandered off, and Harry would help round them up. Her grandmother remembered him as good-hearted and helpful. That comparison with his brother Irvy comes up more than once. In the Chitimo area, Harry was often remembered as the good boy of the family, while Irvy had more of a bad reputation. Emma Goodwin Smith remembered Harry fondly. She said he worked for her father, John Goodwin, and that as kids, they thought he was wonderful. He was strong and well built. He would race with the children, take them sledding in the winter, swimming in the summer, and lift them up to see how high he could raise them. His mother, Sarah, is also worth pausing on because she was clearly central to Harry's life. The memories of Sarah are mixed. Emma Goodwin Smith remembered her as short, heavy, good-natured, and blue-eyed, with gray and auburn hair. After Harry got into serious trouble, Emma said Sarah's hair turned white. Minnie DeRozier remembered Sarah very differently. She described her as, quote, a mean woman, very stern-looking. She was a big, fat woman. She was the terrible, jealous type, hard to get along with. She loved flowers and could be nice when she wanted to be. Well, damn, Minnie, coming in hot, ain't we? But the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Sarah was living a hard life in rough country. She had children to raise, a daughter who died young, and later, a son whose name would become tied to crime and violence across the West. Whatever Sarah's personality really was, Harry seems to have loved her deeply, and later, even after he became Harry Tracy, even after the crimes and the prison breaks and the manhunts, he kept talking about his mother. So when we look at Harry's childhood, we see a lot of pieces that do not fit neatly together, and it does not explain Harry Tracy completely. But it does give us the world that shaped Harry Severns, and pretty soon, that world would start to break apart. The first major tragedy in Harry's young life came from his father. Orlando Severns was well thought of around DeRozier's Lake, Frog Creek, and Chitimo. He was a logger, a hunter, and a capable man. The settlers in that area trusted him enough that when they decided it was time to build a school, Orlando was chosen as treasurer of the first school district. His job was simple, collect the money, and he did just that. Then, he disappeared. According to a story passed down in the Goodwin family, Orlando took a wagon load of vegetables, a team of oxen, and headed toward Superior and never came back. Now there are different versions of why he left. Many DeRozier believe Orlando left because Sarah was domineering and drove him away. But again, Minnie clearly had her own issues with Sarah, so we have to keep that in mind. Emma Goodwin Smith remembered things differently. According to Emma, Orlando did not seem to pay much attention to Sarah in the first place. She remembered one moment where Emma's father offered to take Sarah into town to get some things, and Emma's mother said something along the lines of, quote, your husband would never bother to do that for you. Sarah's reply was, no, I guess he wouldn't. And if you're like me, I'm starting to feel bad for Sarah. But whatever was really happening inside that marriage, it does not sound like Orlando and Sarah were exactly happy. But the way Orlando left had to be humiliating. He had been trusted with school money, he collected it, then he vanished. And even if the school was eventually built, and even if some people later look back on the story with a little humor, for Sarah, this had to have been devastating. Once Sarah was sure Orlando was not coming back, she began divorce proceedings in 1891 at the Washburn County Courthouse in Shell Lake. But those proceedings were never completed. For most people in the community, Orlando just disappeared, but the family eventually knew what happened. Orlando had gone to Kansas. There, he became a section foreman on the railroad, and in 1891, while working near Hutchinson, Kansas, he was killed in a railroad accident. According to one version, Orlando and another worker were on a railroad handcar about half a mile east of the depot at Hutchinson when they were struck by a westbound Santa Fe train. Orlando's injuries were terrible. His leg was badly mangled, his skull was fractured, and he died about 15 minutes later. The other worker survived with a broken arm. Orlando was only in his early 40s. He was buried in Pottersfield with no headstone marking his grave. And for Harry, this had to matter. We do have to be careful here. We cannot sit here more than a century later and pretend we know exactly what was going on in Harry's mind. We cannot say, this is what made him an outlaw. That would be way too simple. But we also should not ignore it. Harry was a teenager when his father disappeared and died. He was old enough to understand shame. He was old enough to see what it did to his mother. And he was old enough to know that his father had left under ugly circumstances and that the family was left to deal with the aftermath. According to Jim Dolanty, it is reasonable to assume Orlando's behavior had some influence on Harry. Not that Orlando's disappearance explains everything, but it was one more crack into Harry's world. Not long after, Sarah married Ed Goodwin, an old family friend. The Goodwins and Severns had known each other for years, and Harry seems to have gotten along with Ed. This was not some stranger suddenly stepping into the family. Ed was part of the same small world around Wisconsin. But by then, Harry was growing older. He was no longer just a boy hanging around his grandparents or helping neighbors with their cows. He was starting to move into the working world. And for a young man in that part of Wisconsin, that meant the woods, the railroads, and the logging camps. John Goodwin ran a logging camp on Frog Creek, and he took a liking to Harry. While Harry was still a teenager, Goodwin hired him as a cook. Harry first learned by helping John's wife, Alzina, and over time he became known as a good camp cook. Now, a logging camp was not a gentle place. It was a rough world of working men, long days, cold weather, heavy labor, drinking, gambling, stories, fights, and men who were used to living away from settled life. Even as a cook or cook's helper, Harry would have been around that world every day. He would have heard the talk, watched how men carried themselves, and learned how to get along in a hard crowd. He also worked on the railroads. Both Harry and Irvy worked for railroad lines that were building through the Monoin area. Harry worked as a brakeman on the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad, usually called the Omaha Road. That line ran north toward Ashland on Lake Superior. The work was hard, the towns were small, and for a young man who wanted excitement, the West still had that pull. There was more movement out there, more opportunity, more danger, more room to become somebody else. And soon, Harry Severns would leave the logging world behind, and when he did, he would not come back. On the 5th of July, 1895, Harry left mining. He had done this kind of thing before. For several summers, Harry had gone west to help with the wheat harvest in the Dakotas. A lot of Wisconsin loggers did the same thing. In the winter, their teams of horses were used in the woods, skidding logs through the snow and across frozen streams. But in the summer, when logging slowed down, those same teams could be taken west and put to work in the harvest fields. And for a young man like Tracy, it was also a chance to get away from the same small towns, the same woods, and the same life he had always known. That summer, Harry and 3 other men took 2 of John Goodwin's teams and drove them toward Fargo. Harry had gone alone on trips like this before, usually as a cook or cook's helper, so at the start, there was no reason to think this trip would change the course of his life. But according to the version remembered by Emma Goodwin Smith and Jack Goodwin, this is where Harry's outlaw trail really began, and if their version is true, it began over $2. One Saturday night, Harry was camped with a harvest crew in a field near Fargo. He wanted to go into town, but he needed money, so he asked another member of the crew if he could borrow some. The man said no. He told Harry he had only $2 himself, and he planned to use it later when he went into town. That should have been the end of it, but after dark, when the man was asleep, Harry went through his clothes and took the money. Then Harry and another man headed into town. By the next morning, the missing money was discovered. The crew member woke up, checked his clothes, and the $2 was gone, and it probably did not take long for suspicion to fall on Harry. So the crew started after him. At first, this was probably still a crew matter. A man had been robbed, and the other workers wanted the money back, or at the very least, they wanted answers. But as they followed Harry's trail into town, the situation began to grow. The local sheriff had gotten involved, and once that happened, Harry was not just dealing with angry coworkers anymore. But by the time the crew and sheriff caught up to the situation, the trouble had already moved beyond the stolen $2. According to the Goodwin family version, Harry and the man with him had also stolen horses and guns, and that changed everything. This was no longer just a young man stealing a little money from another worker. In that world, horses were transportation, labor, income, and escape. And if Harry had taken horses from the crew, especially John Goodwin's outfit, he was taking the very thing those men needed to work and get back home. And once guns were added to it, the whole thing became even more serious. Now Harry and his companion were not just suspected of theft. They were armed, they were mounted, they were being pursued by the men they had wronged, and the sheriff was with them. So when Harry and his partner saw the crew and sheriff coming, they had a choice. They could stop and surrender, or they could try to get away. They tried to get away and open fire. That was the point where everything changed. The $2 may have started it, but firing on the men who came after them made it something Harry could not simply explain away. After that, he could not return to Wisconsin just as another young man who had gotten into trouble out west. Harry and his companion escaped, but that escape came at a cost. From that moment forward, Harry Severns was no longer just a restless young worker who had made a bad decision. He was a fugitive, and whether he fully understood it yet or not, the life he had known in Wisconsin was over. But as always with Harry Tracy, there is another version. In this other account, Harry did not steal the $2. Instead, he went into town, got into a barroom fight, and badly hurt a man. When he was taken into court, he gave officers the name Harry Tracy. He claimed self-defense, was cleared, and left. But when the rest of the crew returned to Wisconsin, Harry was not with them. So whether it was a $2 theft, stolen horses and guns, and shots fired, or a barroom fight that forced him to move on, the result is basically the same. Harry Severns never returned to Wisconsin. This is also where the name Harry Tracy starts to matter. There are several stories about how Harry Severns became Harry Tracy, and like a lot of his early life, the truth is hard to pin down. One story says Harry threw a poleaxe during trouble on a logging jam, hit a man in the head, thought he had killed him, and fled under a new name. One story says that he got into trouble with an old logger teamster named Mike Tracy on the Owens River in Douglas County, Wisconsin. In that version, Harry was working as a cook's helper and carried water for the older man. One winter, Harry chopped a hole in the river ice to get cooking water. Later, a team of oxen drank from that hole, broke through the ice, and fell in. The teamster blamed Harry and came after him. Harry supposedly knocked him down with a bar of soap tied inside a sock. Now to be fair, Mike Tracy was a real person. He appears to have been a neighbor of Harry's parents in mining around that time. So maybe Harry borrowed the name from him. But the dramatic stories around that name are harder to trust. Emma Goodwin Smith and Jack Goodwin were very clear that those stories were not the real explanation for how Harry went bad. They did not know exactly why he chose the name Tracy, but they believed he may have used it to protect his family. And honestly, that would make sense. If Harry had crossed the line into real criminal trouble, the Severns name meant something back home. His grandfather had been respected, his mother still lived in that community. Using another name may have been a way to separate his new life from the people he left behind. But even that is not certain. Emma and Jack also said Tracy was Harry's middle name, but that does not seem to hold up. Emma said Tracy was his mother's maiden name, but Sarah's maiden name was Atkinson. So either the family memory was confused or the name came from somewhere else. Maybe from Mike Tracy, maybe from someone Harry knew, maybe from a name he simply liked. Whatever the exact reason, by the time Harry left the harvest crew and began drifting farther west, the old name was fading. Harry Severns was a boy from Wisconsin. Harry Tracy was the man he was becoming. And once that new name took hold, it would follow him through every robbery, every prison sentence, every escape, every newspaper headline, and eventually all the way to that wheat field in Washington. We do not know exactly where Tracy went after the trouble in the Dakotas. There are scattered glimpses of Harry during this period, but they are hard to nail down. According to Dolanty, if Harry really did get into trouble in the Dakotas in the summer of 1895, then several months, maybe close to a year, are basically unaccounted for. He may have gone into Wyoming, or more likely, he either rode freight cars west as a hobo or worked his way west on the railroad. Harry had worked for the railroad back in Wisconsin, so the idea that he used rail lines to drift west is much more believable than the dime novel version of him immediately galloping off with some famous outlaw gang. One name that comes up here is Hollis B. Foltz. Foltz said Harry Tracy first came into the news on the West Coast after an unsolved murder on First Avenue in Seattle in 1896. According to that account, Tracy was working at the time as a student fireman on the Northern Pacific Railroad. Now, this does not prove Tracy committed that murder, and I do not want to imply that. The important part is that this account places him near Seattle, around railroad work in 1896. Then there is Frank Donnelly. Frank Donnelly was interviewed in Denver in 1902 and was the foreman of the Union Pacific, switching crews there, and he claimed he knew Harry Tracy well. According to Donnelly, he had known Tracy 10 years ago and had worked with him on the railroads in the Northwest. Donnelly said they worked on lines out of Seattle, Spokane, and Helena. Now, Donnelly points out a problem with that memory. Donnelly was speaking in 1902, so when he said 10 years ago, that would push the memory back to around 1892. That timing does not really work. It was probably closer to 6 years earlier, around 1896. But even if Donnelly's date was off, the basic idea still makes sense. The Northern Pacific served the cities he mentioned, and Harry already had railroad experience. So even though we may have to be cautious with the exact details, this railroad version of Harry's westward drift is much more believable than the stories that throw him straight into the Wild Bunch or the hole-in-the-wall crowd. At this point, he was probably not a famous outlaw. He was probably a man moving along the rails, working when he needed to, hiding when he had to, and drifting farther west under the name Harry Tracy. Before we follow Harry Tracy south toward Utah, there is one more piece of the legend we need to deal with, and that is the claim that Harry Tracy was part of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. This is one of those stories that shows up again and again, and honestly, it is easy to understand why people want to connect him to that world. Harry Tracy was a Western outlaw. He moved through rough country. He lived around railroad towns, saloons, logging camps, and drifting men. He used aliases, he carried guns, he ended up in prison, he escaped, he became famous. So later writers looked at all of that and thought, well, he must have belonged with Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Kid Curry, and the hole-in-the-wall crowd. But this is where we have to be careful. There's a big difference between moving through the outlaw country and actually being a member of the Wild Bunch. I'll give the short answer right away. Harry Tracy was almost certainly not a true member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Now, does that mean he never brushed against that world? He may have passed through Wyoming or Colorado. He may have been around places where outlaws moved in and out. He may have even crossed paths with men who were connected to that larger network. And as his story moves west, especially once Utah and Colorado enter the picture, it becomes easier to see why people later tried to place him near that circle. But the evidence does not show Harry Tracy riding as one of them. It does not show him planning robberies with Butch Cassidy. It does not show him as a regular member of the hole-in-the-wall crowd. And it does not show him as one of the trusted figures inside the Wild Bunch. And that matters, because once a man becomes famous, especially a violent outlaw like Harry Tracy, stories start attaching themselves to him. And if people can connect him to other famous outlaws, the story gets bigger. It gets easier to sell, it sounds more exciting, but it also gets less accurate. Some accounts claim Tracy spent time at Hole-in-the-Wall. Others tied him to the Powder River country. Some made him a minor figure in the early Wild Bunch. The problem is that many of those same accounts also get basic details of his life wrong. They get his birthplace wrong, they confuse his early crimes, they repeat shaky stories about his childhood. And once the foundation is that shaky, we should be careful about building too much on top of it. The most honest version is this. Harry Tracy probably moved near the edges of that outlaw world, but he was not truly part of it. And honestly, his story does not need Butch Cassidy to make it interesting. If anything, forcing Harry Tracy into the Wild Bunch makes him smaller. It turns him into a side character in someone else's legend. But Harry Tracy became infamous for his own reasons. The crimes, the prison breaks, the escapes, the manhunts, the way he could charm people one minute and terrify them the next. And eventually, the way his final run through the Pacific Northwest seemed to mark the end of an older kind of outlaw story. By this point in Harry's life, the pieces were starting to come together. By late summer or fall of 1896, the trail becomes more solid. Harry Tracy was in the timber country north of Spokane, near Loon Lake. Loon Lake sat about 40 miles north of Spokane, surrounded by the kind of country Harry already understood: timber, water, rough work, isolated cabins, and men who made their living in the woods. In the 1960s, Spokane writer Gary Williams looked into Tracy's time at Loon Lake and spoke with Archie Swope, a retired postmaster who remembered the local tradition. Swope identified the area tied to Tracy's cabin and said Tracy worked for J.W. Dunlap during the winter of 1896 to 1897. Dunlap was connected to both lumber and railroad interests, which fits the path Tracy seems to have been traveling. Not yet a famous outlaw, but a drifting young man moving between railroad work and timber work. Then there was a cabin on Corbin Bay, on the west side of Loon Lake near Big Island. Tracy either lived there or was closely connected to it. Whether he built the cabin himself is more doubtful. Later old-timers who studied photographs of the place thought it looked too well built for a young lumberjack who spent most of his time working in the woods. So the safer version is that Tracy lived in or around the cabin, not necessarily that he built it. But that cabin became part of his legend, and like almost everything connected to Harry Tracy, a story grew around it. According to local tradition, Tracy became involved with a married woman while he was at Loon Lake. Her two brothers, remembered as the Willman Boys, supposedly decided to put a stop to it. One winter night, armed with shotguns, they came to Tracy's cabin and caught him there with their sister. Tracy did not care to explain himself, he just ran. The brothers opened fire and Tracy bolted from the cabin down toward the lake, in the dead of winter, across the frozen Loon Lake in nothing but his underwear, leaving the cabin behind along with a woman, her brothers, and whatever wages he had earned. Did this really happen, or was it more local legend than cold hard truth? I wasn't able to find for sure. Therefore, let's just say it happened because it's too good of a story for it not to be, am I right? But what we do know is that Tracy left in a hurry. How do we know this? Dunlap reportedly still had wages owed to him. Later, he would show people Tracy's name in his ledger listing as employees, and say that if Tracy ever came back, he would pay him. But Harry Tracy never came back for that money. Over the years, the cabin itself became part of the public memory of Harry Tracy. People wanted to see it. Boat excursions reportedly took visitors out to view the place. The cabin became a local attraction. A physical reminder that before Tracy became the terror of the Pacific Northwest, he had once been there, in that quiet timber country north of Spokane. But unfortunately, in the late 1920s, the cabin burned during a 4th of July fireworks celebration. After Loon Lake, he moved on again. His trail began bending south, away from the timber country north of Spokane and toward Utah. By then, Harry had already left a lot behind him. Wisconsin was no longer just a place on the map. It was the old life. The farther west he went, the easier it became for Harry Severns to disappear, and the easier it became for Harry Tracy to take over. But the road south would bring him into a different kind of trouble. Up to this point, Harry's story has been about drifting, a broken family, a bad decision in the Dakotas, a new name, railroad work, timber camps, Loon Lake, and trouble that seems to end with him leaving before anyone could hold on to him. But in Utah, Harry Tracy would meet someone who changed the pace of the story. His name was David Lant. Lant was a young, handsome, restless, and in many ways, he came from a background just as respectable as Harry's. He had people who loved him, a name that meant something, and a life that could have gone in a very different direction. But like Harry, something in him was already pulling him away from that life. He was drifting, getting into fights, making enemies, and moving closer to the kind of trouble that does not just embarrass a family, but destroys one. And once Harry Tracy and David Lant crossed paths, the story changed. Harry was no longer a lone drifter moving through railroad towns and timber camps. With Lant, he found a companion who seemed to carry the same restlessness, the same willingness to take risks, and the same dangerous pull toward violence. Together, the two men would move through Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming, and the trouble around Harry Tracy would become more serious, more public, and much harder to walk away from. I hope you all enjoyed episode 1 of our deep dive into the life of Harry Tracy. Next week, we will pick up with Harry Tracy heading south toward Utah, meeting David Lant, and once those two cross paths, Tracy's story gets darker, more violent, and much harder to turn back from. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you get your podcasts, please give a 5-star rating and leave a review. I appreciate y'all's amazing support. I can't thank y'all enough. And again, a huge thank you to Paul Knowles and the Museum of Northwest Colorado and Craig with their amazing help with this series. If you get the opportunity, go to the museum. They have done amazing work. Join the Wild West Deep Dives family. For just $1 a month, you'll get access to bonus content. I've recently released the last bonus episode on Nevada's shooting machine, the execution of Andrei Mirkovich. We will see y'all next week, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.